People often ask me which bit of the Sahara archaeologists choose to dig up. Why they choose to dig up one dune rather than another. Well, the answer is that some dunes are covered in magical things. They're a little darker than the normal sand dunes because they have lots of bits of pottery on them. Like this here, you see, it's studded with things that people have made. Look, this piece of pottery here with its ribbing tells you that it's Roman. In fact, you also know that this is actually a Roman wine jar. Handles are fairly common. This would have fitted on a similar jar, you see, a bit higher up. Then you'd have had another handle at the bottom, sort of like that sort of thing, and you'd have poured out your Italian wine here in the middle of the Sahara in your villa. I think these probably quite rich people here. They drank their wine out of the finest bits of Syrian glass. Look at that, brought here all the way from Syria, the glassworks of Damascus. Actually, plates with stamped decoration on them. Perhaps they came from Italy. Lovely bits of faience. The Romans, too, took up the Egyptian faience, blue like the Egyptian sky. They loved it for table decorations, putting their dates and pomegranates and things like that in. Look at that, as light as a feather. Desiccated by the desert air after thousands of years. A piece of a Roman comb. You can almost see the matron's white hairs gathered up around it. So you can see that really these little crusty hills here are like time capsules, and inside are ancient people's lives, everything they ever had. And this place, in fact, is a very special place because here, quite close to here, the oldest bits of the New Testament in the world have been found. In towns, you can see that when you excavate them, look just like this one. There are dozens of these towns in Egypt at the edge of the desert. Towns with names like Karanis, Oxyrhynchus, Crocodilopolis. 2,000 years ago, they were well-to-do Greek colonies. The real archaeological treasure here is in this funny-looking dirt stuff. The archaeologists that came here were looking for papyri, and they were looking for a very special layer. There's a bit of it here. It's what the local people called the akfsh. And you can see this is ancient straw preserved in it. And this is quite soft here, and it's not acidic like the dark soils above, and it's not hard like the floors below. And in this tiny little layer, this is where all the papyri were found. And actually, the amazing thing was that the first discovery they announced to the world, a really important discovery, was of a gospel. But it wasn't the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It was the gospel of Thomas. Completely new collections of sayings of Jesus came out at the turn of the century, and by the 1920s, one of these sayings, "Cleave the rock and you will find me," found its way into the English hymn book. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery came a few years later. That was when somebody discovered that a tiny little fragment of papyrus that had come from one of these towns was much older than they previously thought. You see, ancient handwriting you can date more or less like modern handwriting. And this piece of writing could be dated to about 130 AD. Now, the most extraordinary thing about it was a piece of the Gospel of John. And the date made it the oldest piece of the Gospel of John, the oldest piece of the New Testament, indeed, ever found. And so it has remained. And it's rather apt that with all the surprises and amazing things that have come out of this desert, especially to do with the New Testament, it bears the words, "And Pilate said, 'What is truth?'" Well, I don't know what Pontius Pilate thought about truth, but I do know that when I visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, that whole question of truth is the first thing that pops into my mind.
Jesus from Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Where Christ he was crucified, they put the cross. There is a hole where the cross was stood. You can feel it. You can put your hand. Go inside.
De Nazaret, el rey de los judíos. está en hebreo, en latín.
According to the New Testament, two things happened when Jesus died. In the minute that he died, an earthquake happened. And then a crack was created in the rock. And over there, we can feel today the original crack in the rock. In the original rock, the old marble covers today.
This was to be his mother and Mary Magdalene?
Yes, Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene.
Gorgeous, isn't it?
On your right-hand side, you can see the tomb of Christ. Also, you can see a small altar. This altar represents the rolling stone that used to block the entrance to the tomb.
Then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes, as in the manner of Jews is to bury. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new sepulchre, wherein was man never yet laid. Well, the place of crucifixion and the tomb of Jesus, the faithful believe actually in this church. People to come here and they see the sacred sites and they come here to pray, actually then move in the landscape of the New Testament. They're actually moving into the landscape of a book. And what a book. It's a book that's really given shape and form to Western civilization. Christendom. Christendom, the lands of Christ, Jesus Christ. Well, are the four Gospels which have him as a hero, are they true? Or are they just a con? Perhaps something invented by the church to get money out of people? Or are they the word of Almighty God? Who wrote those four Gospels? Who put them together? Where did they come from? What about this man, Jesus Christ? Is he true? Is he a real historical figure? Well, there's something I can say right away, and that is whoever wrote this book really understood ancient Palestine, understood the landscape, and he understood the ancient people too.
When you come to Galilee, you quickly realize that the people who wrote the Gospels really knew this area. They knew its landscape, they knew its plants, they knew its crops. And their Jesus, the Jesus they describe, was a countryman from here too, a real countryman. When he talks about the lilies of the field, that's the poppies and the little daisies that grow around Galilee. When he talks about the lilies of the field, he compares them with great Solomon, the king of Jerusalem. All his stories are about planting and sowing and the fish from the lake and things like that. I suppose, really, that's how the people of Jerusalem saw the Galileans. There was a traditional north-south divide. The people of Jerusalem saw the northerners as thick, people with heavy accents, a bit slow. There were sort of Galilean jokes going around the place. And in their turn, the Galileans saw the Jerusalemites as soft southerners, Hellenized, didn't think much of the priests. The Galileans were fervent nationalists, big fighters for freedom. And they had holy men, quite unorthodox holy men, who actually talked directly to God.
Now, we know all that about the Galileans because there were lots of Jewish books written at the time that tell us what was going on. But none of them mention Jesus of Nazareth. There isn't any record of him until long after he's supposed to have died. On the other hand, this is a real enough ruin. It's probably the ancient town of Capernaum, and that's as much a part of the New Testament as the lilies of the field and Lake Galilee. Actually, it's an ancient fishing village with a synagogue in the middle. Some of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. Peter lived at Capernaum, the Gospels tell us, and Jesus stayed in his house.
No wonder Christian archaeologists have been so keen to dig the place up. Archaeologists started work here about 80 years ago on the most impressive bit. The ruins of a synagogue made of imported stone that had been parked like a great white Cadillac in the middle of the village. Since those days, a succession of Franciscan archaeologists have worked here. Brother Wendelin, Father Gaudens, and Father Virgilio, all working with great piety and special care. And they found some lovely things. What the archaeologists discovered as they dug away the foundations of the synagogue was that the Great White Synagogue, Great White building, had been fitted very carefully onto an earlier wall. Now, this was quite exciting because that synagogue was 2nd century, and it looked from the fragments and things they found in the older wall that it could be 1st century. In other words, it could be from the age of Jesus. Do you remember in the Bible a certain centurion who lived in Capernaum, whose servant Jesus cured with a miracle? Well, do you remember in that story the elders go to Jesus to ask him to cure their centurion's servant because the centurion has been good to them. He's built their local synagogue. Now, if the archaeology of this wall has been correctly assessed, and if the Gospels are telling us the truth, that could well be the synagogue that the centurion built. And if that's so, it could be that the pavement underneath it and the town that's associated with it is the town of Jesus himself. So these black basalt walls are the remains of little houses. Could they be where Jesus' friends and disciples had lived? Where he miraculously cured a paralyzed man? Take up your bed and go to your own house, he says in the Gospels. As the fathers dug through this village, they were rolling back 2,000 years of time. When they started working in this area here, well, they really couldn't have believed their luck, I expect, because they came across something very unusual for such a simple site. They came across these huge octagonal walls, one inside the other. Now, from the pottery, they knew that these were 4th or 5th century. And from the shape of the walls themselves, they knew they'd come across the foundations of an early church. They carried on working, and in the middle of that, it is now under that tin roof over there, they found a yet earlier church. It was about 100 years earlier, they thought, and the walls had been very beautifully plastered. And although the plaster was a bit rotten, there were still hundreds of inscriptions on it, and these could all be read. And in amongst the names there were the names of Jesus Christ and the names of Peter himself. They must have felt that they were slowly coming down on the very house of St. Peter himself. As the Franciscans dug up the earth floor, the centre of the house, they found fragments of things that, when they glued them together, looked like this. It's a little pottery lamp, and the interesting thing about it is that, unlike all other ancient pottery lamps, it's been made on a potter's wheel. Look, you can see that lovely round shape, a spinning little shape there where it's spun on the wheel, and a little bit where the wick comes out, we can still see on this one, it's got soot on it, is stuck on afterwards. Now, these lamps were only made in a very special time. They were made, really, in the time of King Herod. And when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, they absolutely stopped. So these lamps are almost contemporary with Jesus Christ himself. They didn't find much else in the house. There was absolutely no domestic pottery. Even though this had been a kitchen or a family room, there was no domestic pottery. It was a couple of fish hooks. Were they the fish hooks of St. Peter? Who knows? The walls were perfectly plastered, which was unique in the whole house, and they'd been plastered and painted many, many times. And that was unique in the whole village. Now, they had found a house of the right period, and they'd found special care and attention and special cleanliness inside the room. But could it be the house of St. Peter? Well, the friars had no doubt. They actually entitled their archaeological publication The House of St. Peter. Now, usually, archaeological reports are considered to be scientific documents. That means they've got to have proper scientific titles. Now, the House of St. Peter is not a proper scientific title. The archaeologists, the good friars, have found nothing in that house at all, which actually could prove that Peter had lived there at that time. So, although their book looks like a scientific report, it really isn't one at all. And all the other archaeologists that worked in the Holy Land told them so too. All the things that had been excavated in the ancient house, the pottery, the fish hooks, and all the rest of it, were of the time of St. Peter. On that, everybody was agreed. But only the friar's booklet said that the ancient house had been St. Peter's. Nothing they'd found there had proved it. All the inscriptions with Peter and Jesus' name on them have been made by Christians hundreds of years later. The only thing the fathers had proved about St. Peter at Capernaum was the power of their own belief. You know, the story of Jesus in Capernaum, the way history and the Gospels seem to move closer and closer together, and suddenly at the last moment seem to pull apart. Well, you can repeat that dozens of times with other Gospel stories. It's almost deliberate. It's almost as if the writers of the Gospels refuse to connect history and their faith together, as if they wouldn't degrade their faith in the Lord with mere historical fact. Actually, even mere historical fact requires some degree of faith. Take Alexander the Great, for example. There's a well-known historical figure for you. Well, there's 3 or 4 semi-fabulous, sort of part legendary biographies of him. That's all, really. But what there is, what the man has left, is his effect. His armies built Greek temples practically on the borders of India where he'd taken them to. His policies had reorganized all the ancient world. That's why, at the end of the day, we know that he lived, that he was a real man. And that, too, I suggest, is why we can say that Jesus was a real man and lived. It's the effect of him that counts. The fact that shortly after his death, there was churches everywhere, that Gospels were being written. That's how we know that there must have been some energy at the centre of all that. But Jesus, unlike Alexander, was a humble man. Alexander's dad was a king, he was a king. There were coins, there were court things. Everything to do with Alexander was on a higher level. Jesus, however, the humble man, lived in a little fishing village. We don't know the names of anybody who lived in Capernaum. It would be unreasonable to find written documentation of Jesus or Peter the fisherman. We shouldn't expect to find it. Ordinary lives of humble people. What we can say is from those houses, from that village, from the Gospels themselves, came such an effect that we can say that Jesus was a real historical figure. If we say that Jesus really lived, then at last we can begin to fit him into the history of his own times. And you do it like this. There are about 360 stories in the Gospels. Let's see how they fit into real historical first-century Palestine. Ancient Palestine, where the Jews were governed by the Romans. What would have happened, for example, if a real guy had turned up in the Temple of Jerusalem in Jesus' time and had a punch-up with the money changers? What would people have thought about the idea of a God being your father? Our Father, which art in heaven, Jesus says. Would it have made him popular? Would it have got him arrested, or what? It's a great historical game fitting Jesus into history. It's been going on a long time, too. The trouble is that the Gospels tell us that the length of time from Jesus' baptism in the River Jordan to his crucifixion in Jerusalem, the span of his entire career on earth, was just 3 years. And that's a very small period of time in ancient history. there's not much to go on. I think at the end of the day, you can say now that historians have a little sort of set of rules that you can say about Jesus that are true historical facts about him. It's based on a lot of scrupulous research about the Roman Empire and the accuracy of the Gospels and how the words in the Gospels themselves deal with certain civil and civic facts. Now, historians themselves wouldn't claim, for example, the resurrection or the miracles, but what they claim is, when this man lived, that as a man preaching the things he did, walking on the earth and coming into contact with the civil, military authorities that he came in contact, that there is a likelihood that these things are true of the man. It's what you can call the historian's creed, if you like, and it's fairly short and fairly simple. It goes something like this. Jesus lived in Galilee. He preached, he healed, he had followers, he came to Jerusalem, he argued with the temple authorities, and he was crucified by the Romans. And that, they would tell you, is what you can know about this unknowable man. Nowadays, a lot of historians think that Pilate's residence in Jerusalem, where civilians would have been brought for trial before the Romans, would have been the old palace of King Herod. And that's buried today here in the pretty Arab remains of the citadel. There you can still see the great massive walls of Herod's original palace. The same walls that every Jew brought for trial here would have seen in the days of Pontius Pilate. It's very strange that exactly at the moment when you could expect to find Jesus entering history, when the very Son of God, the Gospel writer's Son of God, is on trial for his life before a Roman civil court, it's very strange that at that moment, when you should be closest to him, when faith and civil law almost seem to meet, that the figure seems to dissolve. I suppose that could be not only because the way the actual trial is reported in the Gospels is very enigmatic and strange, but also because the people of Jerusalem were divided up into so many different factions that each one would have had a different Jesus. Just think of some of the people around in Jerusalem. They were Jesus' own disciples. Now, he was to them the Messiah, sent to redeem the world. There were zealots, religious fundamentalists, and they were looking for a Messiah too, but a military one to kick the Romans out. Then there were the Jerusalem priests, who knew a lot about Jesus. He was a man who'd been preaching that you didn't need to go to their temple. You didn't need to offer in their temple to achieve redemption. He then was attacking their authority and their meal tickets. They'd have been very pleased to see him in trouble with the Romans. For Pilate, of course, the man in front of him, well, lonely and strange as he was another Messiah. He'd already crucified several and would crucify several more. It really didn't matter much to him at all. So think of all those people who wanted Jesus dead or martyred or going up to heaven or something. And those are just some of the opinions that would have surrounded Jesus as he was led out to execution. And that's just a reconstruction of events based on a mixture of the gospel stories and the tough political realities of the day. As he walked down this narrow lane that leads from Pilate's palace to the Rock of Calvary, Jesus would have been the focus of an enormous range of passions and opinions. The newspapers of the day could have given us very different points of view. The Gospels, of course, written later on by men who thought that Jesus was the Son of God. Where in all this is reality, is real history? Where can you find the truth? Christ, hanging here on his cross upon the rock of Calvary, has moved right out of earthly realities. He's moved from fact to faith. He hangs in the future, in the present, in the past. And all around the silent figure, men have made so many choices, seen him in so many different ways. And we only know of the man from the Gospels, and they were written generations after he'd been crucified and buried. So Jesus of Nazareth was enshrined in a book. The four Gospels told the world that he was Jesus Christ, the risen Lord. But who wrote these Gospels? Were they really written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And when and where were they composed? One of the very oldest traditions of the Christian Church tells us that St. Mark took water from this spring, and that he used the water to mix the ink to write his Gospel, and that he wrote his Gospel here to the dictation of St. Peter the fisherman.
This old cave is cut in the cliffs high above the site of ancient Antioch, right at the tip of modern Turkey. Church traditions say that this little grotto is actually the oldest church in the world. You know, in the time of Christ, along with Rome and Alexandria in Egypt, this city, Antioch, was the greatest city in the world. And what a city it was, what a reputation it had. This is where Antony brought Cleopatra for their sort of a honeymoon. Also had a very large Jewish population. After all, Palestine, Jerusalem, is not too far down the coast from here. So when the book of Acts says that when the first Christians in Jerusalem were persecuted, as Jews, it wouldn't be surprising that they upped their sticks and came here and joined the Jewish community. Church tradition again tells us that in Antioch, Christians were first called Christians. That is, not the followers of Jesus or some other thing. So you see, old Antioch has a very important place in early Christianity. That lovely story of St. Mark and his ink could well be true. The trouble with that is that there's an equally strong tradition that says that what St. Mark really did was went to Rome with St. Peter, and there it was that Peter dictated his gospel. And then, after Peter was martyred, the story says that Mark then travelled to Alexandria where he wrote the final draft of his gospel. So, for every single tradition, and strong tradition, there's an equally strong contradictory one about who wrote these gospels.
Add all those contradictory traditions together, though, and what you soon see is Christianity spreading very quickly through the Roman Empire. Churches sprung up like mushrooms at Antioch, and cities like Smyrna in Asia Minor, Alexandria in Egypt, Corinth in Greece, and great Rome itself. The Gospels were made in this period. They may have been written in one country, edited in another, and copied out and published somewhere else. For Christianity had become completely international.
Seems to me, what you can really say about the Gospels and their writing goes something like this. For one thing, the first Christian preachers, Jesus, the Apostles, St. Paul, didn't write much at all. They were preachers. Jesus only wrote one word that we know of. The Gospels tell us he wrote it on sand. St. Paul only wrote his epistles when he couldn't actually turn up at the church in person. This was a faith that was being spread by the power and passion of the word itself. It wasn't then until that generation of preachers that was spreading the faith right round the Mediterranean, right through North Africa into Italy, Greece, all over the place. It wasn't until that generation had actually started to die that the church decided that it would write the stuff down
because these people were preaching the sayings of Jesus, anecdotes about his life, where he was born. And there was a sort of considerable body of this that obviously built up. And then, in this period when the old men had started to die, the church, as one church historian said, actually suffered a loss of nerve. That was that the power of those first words was going to be diminished. So they caught it in print and put it on the page. So what happens? You have the four Gospels, and I think what they represent is books written down by different churches in different places, perhaps one in Rome, one in Alexandria, one in Antioch perhaps, or Ephesus, Asia Minor somewhere. But churches that had shared this similar body of preaching knowledge, the same sort of sayings and stories of Jesus. And they were eager to compare them too and use one version against the other. So you can't say then that the four Gospels are actually four biographies written down by people trailing along after Jesus and copying his every word. But you can say that they are the most authentic witnesses of that amazing wash of faith that was going right through the Mediterranean. This area here is the very centre of Rome. The area that is between the great palaces of the emperors on the hill and the Senate house over there. Roman Senate that controlled the actual empire. This little area in the middle was packed with monuments. Monuments that went back hundreds and hundreds of years. Next to the Senate house was a little round hole. That was called the navel of the universe. Next to that was a golden milestone, and all the Roman roads, the roads that went to the edges of Persia to Scotland, they were all measured from that particular little golden spot. And the touching thing about the middle of this empire, and the thing that's really quite moving when you come here, is actually how small it is. Actually, after all, it started as a marketplace hundreds of years ago. It's a little place where the people of Rome, the little villagers of Rome, could come and flog their cheeses. This was the place, even at the height of empire, where Julius Caesar actually was cremated in that area there. You know, the great speech of Mark Antony, where he roused the Roman populace, that took place here. That was a very little local event between Roman people. So if you were a foreigner then, had something to sell, or religion to offer the world, you would have come here. That's why Peter and Paul came here. They came here to sell the Romans Christianity. It would have been a very difficult job. These Romans were clever people. They inherited all the Greek philosophers. There were Stoics here. There were followers of Aristotle, Plato, people like that. These little Eastern guys turning up, talking about salvation, about the end of the world, about a God full of love, would have passed them by completely. And in fact, it took Christianity hundreds of years to conquer the minds of those sort of people. Rome was captured by Christianity, of course, along with its entire empire. And that's a big part of the problem if you're trying to find out how the New Testament was made. Because almost all the ancient writings about it were made by the winners of a series of rows and debates about the church and its Bible. During its first 2 centuries, Christianity was but one of a dozen Eastern faiths in Rome. It was a muddled thing, and so were many of its preachers. And there was no Bible, no single organization called the Church to tell the faithful what to believe. That the Christianity that we know today ever emerged at all was a close-run thing. Just how close you can still see under the oldest churches of Rome. Many of them are built directly on top of pagan shrines, like this one, built in honor of Mithras, a Persian god. The most evocative of all these Eastern shrines at Rome, where you can really get the feeling of their strange lost world, is a little-known basilica that was found just a few years ago deep under Rome's main railway line.
people who took up these Eastern religions, and they were very popular, thought that faith was not only based on belief, but on personal mystic experience. They formed underground sects of initiates called knowers, Gnostics, the people who know. In their secret meeting places, Jesus, Socrates, Osiris, and Alexander the Great might all be equally revered as guardians of mystic truths. The underground chapel is shaped exactly like a church. Once it was the hall of a sect so secret that it's completely disappeared. We don't even know its name anymore. God alone knows what went on here. These places had their origins in the halls where mystery rites took place, where people were initiated with drugs and terrifying physical ordeals. And yet, if Jesus of Nazareth had turned up in here, people would have greeted him as a great teacher, a fighter against evil and darkness.
All these strange rituals, these lovely Gnostical ideas, might seem innocent enough in themselves. You think, well, you know, Christians could come in here and accept part of this. After all these ideas of lightness and dark and good and evil, they're even in the Bible. You might think this is an innocent enough place. Consider what happened to lots of Christians. Some of them, for example, Gnostic Christians, would take up eating very special diets. They'd think that food itself was divided into good and evil, into light and dark. So you'd only actually eat good food, light food, drink white wine. Cucumbers were a very fashionable food. The way, I suppose, when you cut them, slice them around the edge, they flash in the sun and they're full of light and water. So you'd eat lots of cucumbers. And your theory, of course, would be verified because it would go through your body and the wicked sin will come out as excrement. And, of course, the light will come out in orgasm as semen. So your Gnostic Christians, and lots of them were doing this, were having orgiastic rituals in their churches, drinking the semen, anointing statues and each other with it as part of the love of God itself. That's a fairly shocking idea to modern Christians. And, of course, St. Paul himself differentiates between sacred and profane love. But it was a difference that wasn't nearly so apparent in ancient Rome, and lots of Christians went down the Gnostic path. The teachers in these secret sects wrote and wrote and wrote. These are little fragments of their wisdom from the desert in Egypt, from that amazing time capsule. These are middle-class people. They're thinking the truth lies in the written word. They cherish it. Have big libraries. They're starting to write Christian literature in amongst all this other strange stuff that's going on. But it's not just straight-on Christian literature like we know it. This is Christian literature seen through thousands of years of religious experience. Interpretations of Jesus, not straightforward Christianity. And so you get a most extraordinary body of literature growing up. You get 12 Gospels. One of them tells us that Jesus was gay. You get a wondrous poem that tells us that God was actually a woman. Poems called Thunder, Perfect Mind. And dozens of texts so strange that you can't understand what's in them. You get letters of St. Paul writing to Aristotle, Jesus writing to the King of Edessa. And in amongst all this great mountain of literature, you get the ancient books which will become our modern Bible, mixed up with all this other stuff. And this lot here represents literally the earliest known fragments of the Christian Bible that we possess. These ones were found in a desert monastery. They're preserved in 2 libraries, one in Geneva and here, the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, where each sheet is preserved between sheets of glass. So imagine that. This, for example, is the Gospel of Luke. You know that wonderful paragraph where it says, consider the lilies of the field, Jesus is talking, how they grow, toil not, neither do they spin. Well, just there is the first time you'll ever see that. In our history, this is the first time you can read it. So, if we were doing a history of the Bible and we were saying, look, you know, here's the oldest Bible in the world, no problem, all that happens is it gets copied out from here till today. That's simple, isn't it? But look at it from the other end of the telescope. What you've got is not only this body of text that we think of as the sacred Bible text, but all this stuff too, all this stuff from the underground movements. So the big problem in the church, and not only with what we think of as the church, but all sorts of churches all over the world are equally puzzled. These ancient churches thinking, my God, there's all this literature. What of it is sacred and what of it isn't? About AD 170, a Christian who lived in Asia Minor, a man called Marcion, made the first stab at deciding what of all these ancient Christian books would actually go into a proper Bible. Trouble was, Marcion was a Gnostic. He didn't believe Jesus had been born. He thought that he actually sprung from the brain of God, fully grown. And he also thought Jews were the work of the devil, which somewhat limited his choice of books. The Gospel of Luke was chosen. It was the only Gospel which seemed to him to be any good at all. It was cut down to about a quarter of its proper size, and a couple of Paul's letters were thrown in. So Marcion's choice of books was somehow a manifesto of his beliefs. Now, about the same time, in Italy, there was somebody else composing a list of books suitable for a Christian Bible. And that one is actually much bigger than we've got today. So there's quite a little choice going on all over the place. People are making their own choices. But the one that won, the one we have today, doesn't come from the Holy Land or anywhere in the East. It comes from Lyon in the south of France. Lyon had actually been established by the Romans. It wasn't a French city, it was a Roman city. It was part of that international world that went all around the Mediterranean. It was founded in about AD 50 for the Roman legionaries. And it was actually full of Greeks from Asia Minor. And there were Christian missionaries too who'd come to the town to convert the local people and the Roman soldiers. The temples that the Greeks brought with them from Asia Minor to Lyon are still here. These beautiful ruins high above the modern town. Over there is the Temple of Cybele, the great mother goddess of Asia Minor. Over there, of course, a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the great mother goddess of the Christian faith. Now, the Christians that came here thought of themselves as rather special people. These were people from Antioch, from Smyrna, from Ephesus. Some of them had been taught by people, they said, who had sat at the feet of John himself. They were very, very close to the source of Christianity. And here they were in Lyon. They kept a very tight connection with their old church, though. They learned the local language, they converted local people, but it was a very Eastern church. In the years 150, 160, 170, 180 after Christ, just about the time the Greeks were coming to Lyon, the persecutions began. It was a simple test, really. Did you want to worship the emperor or did you want to worship Jesus Christ? If you worship the emperor, you get to be a good guy and succeed in society. If you want to worship Jesus, you might well end up in an amphitheatre being torn to bits. So it's a sort of a terrible test of wills, really. Here in Lyon, the Greeks were amongst the first to be persecuted. There was a man called Attalus, who came from Pergamum, close to Smyrna. He was a big man. He was very popular in the town. And they led him round in a circle here with a notice on his front. I'm Attalus and I'm a Christian. And that's all Attalus would say, as they heated to red heat an iron chair and sat him in it, and then took him back to the cells and brought him back for 2 successive days until the text says his whole body looked like a wound. And then he died. Lots and lots of people were persecuted here. It's not good enough to say these were just sadomasochists. You're sitting in the front row. The persecuted people are having their blood splashed out. It could go over you. You could smell the burning flesh. What's going on here? It's a sort of terrible psychodrama between hundreds and hundreds of people willing you to do something, and the Christians, some of the Christians, the bravest of them all, not wanting to give up the faith. After lots of martyrs had died at Lyon, including the old bishop who was beaten up and died in prison, the church official, a Greek called Irenaeus, came to a really momentous decision, a decision that would not only affect the Bible, but the entire future history of the church. He wrote a book. It was the first Catholic book, the first universal book of the Christian church, a theological tome called Against the Heresies. His book was a violent attack on a part of the Christian church. It was as if Irenaeus was saying to the audience in the amphitheatre, this is Christianity, this is what our people are dying for. For the Gnostics were dying in that amphitheatre as bravely as members of his own congregation. Like St. Paul before him, Irenaeus believed that true Christianity was his Christianity. He thought that the Gnostics were holy anarchists. He wanted to show the world an organised and universal church, not a secret sect. Irenaeus never tells us directly of his vision in the book. He argues, he insults, he refutes. Christianity, he says, is not like this, it's not like that. And slowly, through his arguments, you begin to see what it was like for him. And as Irenaeus had come from Asia Minor, the old stamping ground of St. John and St. Paul, part of his vision went back to the days of the first church, almost to Jesus and Jerusalem. How then did Irenaeus go about deciding what would go in our Bible? Well, the Old Testament was easy. That had been decided years before, no trouble. But the New Testament, that was still a big problem. What the man relied on at the end of the day was what he considered to be the most sacred thing. Remember, he'd come from Asia Minor. He'd known men in his childhood who had sat at the feet of John. He had a problem, he says once, about the book of Revelations. He could write to a man who he thought had known John himself. The traditions in that part of the church went back through the disciples, even to Jesus. It was a tradition that was a verbal tradition as well as a literary tradition. They knew what was sacred and they knew the heart of the Bible. And this was actually going right through the Mediterranean. Just at the same time the martyrs of Lyon were being killed, martyrs were being killed in North Africa. And when their judges asked them what they were dying for, they said they were dying for the Gospels and the letters of a just man, one Paul. But how many Gospels were there? Well, Irenaeus had no doubt about that at all. He doesn't even begin to defend it on any logical grounds at all. He says there were 4 Gospels. There were 4 Gospels like there were 4 winds, like there were 4 corners of the universe, like the 4 cherubim of Ezekiel's vision. 4 was the order of the universe, and 4 was the heart of his New Testament. It seems rather silly now to ask again if these 4 Gospels are true or false. For in history, as in faith, real truth, insight, is never to be found in bits of information, scientific facts, but in the order, in the patterns that you choose to make with them.
Masterpiece Theater's absorbing drama of an amoral, manipulating man, The Charmer, is next.